All right, welcome everybody. Just want to tell you thank you for coming. Super excited to dig in today. Joined here today with Lauren Rogers, our Director of Client Success. My name's Ben Bergeron, Vice President of Revenue here at In-Telecom. Just super excited to dig into some of the nitty-gritty as we get going this year, right? Share some of the things that we're planning for, but also some of the things that our clients are telling us. Isn't that right, Lauren?
Yeah, absolutely. We're hearing a lot of it, especially in our kickoffs for Q1 QBRs.
Cool. So we'll go ahead and get started. But why January matters, right? Um, it's kind of interesting when you start thinking about how people plan for technology. There's all these different like inflection points throughout the year in which people should be planning, but what we're trying to change that conversation. But what we're seeing is a lot of people are waiting till January to start planning, right? And I think that's leading to a lot of the failure points today within certain organizations is like if you're waiting till January, you're already setting yourself up to fail.
Right. I definitely think it's still looked as a cost center and not really a strategic lever with IT, right? You're typically getting sometimes your budgets from somewhere else. And that's being given to you in January instead of really being part of that pre-planning process and discussing what needs to happen on the tech front.
How do you think like you're trying to change, you and your team are trying to kind of like change that conversation?
We're definitely trying to be part of it. I think that's the importance of having the right technology partner is being in those conversations. Sometimes with the CFOs, absolutely kind of getting in front of them and really being a partner in what we should be planning for. Sometimes it's it's vendor increases that are being announced.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is the life cycle management of it all. Sometimes it is really what are y'all talking about in your annual planning and what do we need to start road mapping now to align your technology to help you kind of get to those outcomes in the business, right? And so it really is, it's riding side saddle with them in Q3 and Q4 to really prep for Q1. And if we're already behind in Q1, that's fine. Let's just catch up, right? Let's get in front of those right people.
It's really funny. Like one of the things we have up here is just like early planning preserves budget control, right?
Yep.
But I think when we meet with IT leaders or even when we meet with C-suite, whether it's CFOs, COOs, you know, everybody is trying to drive their costs down, right?
Right.
But all of our expenses are going up,
Yeah.
right? And that's no different in the IT world, right? Like we're incurring additional costs for the services that we provide, right? And we're doing what we can to mitigate extending those increases to our clients, right? And
Absolutely.
how do we become a little more efficient? How do we offset that cost in other areas of the business? And I really think it starts with like moving from that mindset of being reactive to proactive. And like we talk about it a lot, and I think people like to say that, but they don't actually know what that means. Does
Yeah.
that make sense?
It takes a lot of work to move that needle could start having that mindset, especially when you're still in that reactive mode and that reactive mindset while you're trying to become proactive. You're still kind of in both spots, and so it's difficult sometimes to move that needle, but definitely necessary, especially on the tech front.
And then the other aspect of it is like, to your point, that one of the things that you mentioned is sometimes I feel like IT is the last thing people
Yeah.
talk about, right? Like you go into your annual planning sessions and you're setting these really high expectations or really trying to raise the bar of what you did the previous year or the year before that and like tell your story.
Yep.
And then the last thing that like people end up talking about is the role that IT plays in helping organizations achieve those objectives, right?
Right.
And there's a bunch of different ways to do that, but
Right.
like you have to change the conversation in your planning cadence to make sure you're incorporating your approach to IT every
Mhm.
year, every quarter, every month, right, to help support that organization's objectives.
Yeah, no, 100%. A lot of times we get like I've been in front of a C-suite before, where he's looking at the IT director as we're in the meeting, and he's saying, "I just need my IT director to tell me what he needs for renewals and what he needs for lifecycle management." And that's when I'm kind of steering the conversation of it's beyond that, right? It's how quickly are y'all trying to grow in the next year? I knew where they were at in that specific organization, and there was a really aggressive growth plan And it's so far beyond just the renewals. It's let's talk about strategy of making sure that you can scale quickly, that you're raising the floor on where you're at now. That way you're set up for success in the next 2 and 3 years. And it starts now, right? I will say the conversation with clients in the C-suite is changing huge for 2026, the year of AI, right?
Yeah.
And they're all
Yeah.
coming back from their meet and greets and their different prospective industries and in their meetings. And it's, how can we plug in AI? So for the first time in a while, I do think that we're moving the needle on IT being far more than just the cost center, of it really being on the forefront of being strategic across all organizations, not just some.
Yeah, the AI boom, right?
Yeah.
That's our generation and everything that like we're experiencing, So, and I
Yep.
think that's where it comes in, where like you have this unplanned spend is like when
Yep.
it's an afterthought, right? Is like you have all these plans, whether it's acquisitions, whether it's increased size and workforce, right? Whether it's these automations, right? And like when you don't have the right stakeholders within the organization to represent IT, what happens is you start moving the needle on all those things, and all these things that could have been planned operating expenses
Right.
become massive projects, disruption to the business,
Oh yeah.
and and large capex expenses that the company wasn't necessarily prepared to handle in that year. But yeah, they still need to move the needle. So
Exactly. Yeah. They still have to absorb it somewhere. No, exactly. To your point, it does. It takes a lot of work up front and not just plug and play. And I think sometimes without having the right people in those conversations, there's an assumption there because you just don't know until you've done it. And until you have people in the room who have done it and had the lessons learned, as we all have, right? Especially in this industry. It takes a seat at that table to kind of say, let's prepare for this. Let's have a kind of a budget for the unknowns, and this is typically where it should be in this type of situation.
yep. So one thing I kind of want to really focus on here as we dig into this today, and like you alluded to it, right? I was talking a little bit about it, is everything centered around AI,
Right.
right? And like everybody I meet with, even if they're not a client, right? Even if they're just like one of my peers, somebody I'm talking to, a
Hmm.
friend I'm catching up with, everything today seems to be centered around like someone's AI strategy and how they're incorporating that into their organization. Would you say you're kind of seeing the same thing?
Oh gosh, yes. No, my husband came home from work one day and we were just talking about our day and they were all kind of pulled into a room at their organization on the ops side and kind of saying, start bringing ideas how you can plug AI
Yeah.
into your role. And it's like, okay, let's just plugging AI is such a conversation that's going around in every industry. And it's funny that, yeah, even after work, it's in my daily conversation right now.
It's it's like we've been talking about it for so
Yeah.
long, but it's almost like AI is a stakeholder in the
Yeah.
org today, right? And you're going around. I'm seeing this pivot away from it being like this feature to it actually being a strategy,
Yes.
and more focus on how AI can operate within a business at scale. Yeah,
Exactly. No, it's
and
it's funny because on the voice side, right? We're having clients come in and want to plug in AI in their voice. And that's the first time in a long time that voice is becoming more back to being a more of a strategy versus, 15 years ago when UCAS first started coming out. Now we're talking about it in voice. Obviously, on the MSP side, we talk about it regularly. But it is interesting to see how it's across the board and everything that touches technology. Everybody's wanting to come to the table and start talking about the features of AI and what it can do.
yeah, I think it definitely is like becoming this like dominant
Yeah.
force
Yeah.
that's shaping organizational strategy in 2026. And like I was saying, they're moving from like experimentation
Yeah.
to true scaling across multiple workflows, products, core systems, like the different things, right? It was ChatGPT, right? Gemini, whatever, Claude, all the different things that people would use, right? And now like you're seeing all of that different advancement to where now it's becoming um, more like multi-step tasks,
Yeah.
decision making with minimal human oversight, all these different things that people are looking to automate outside of just oh, let me chat with it, have a chat bot and like help me create ideas, right? It's like really becoming critical to people's organization.
No, look, we've definitely had a couple of clients come to us and say that they're looking to replace departments with AI, right? And we're having that conversation of kind of the pre-planning that takes. Obviously we don't, you're not taking jobs there. It becomes more of a digital employee of sorts instead of just another tech piece. And I definitely think the pre-planning that goes into that is something people are realizing as they start kind of injecting a little bit of it at a time. And the pre-planning, especially to your point for workflows of you can't replace an employee without all the workflows being mapped out correctly and what is the infrastructure built to do.
And you're really not trying to replace, right?
Right.
What you're trying to do is optimize efficiency, reduce
Exactly.
like human error, and like get people focused on the things that make the most impact to the organization versus some of those more redundant tasks, right? As those manual entries, whatever that looks like, But
Exactly.
there's some key steps that I think organizations need to face, like when we're talking about an AI strategy, right? So it's adoption, like
Mhm.
we have it up here, right? So like governance, right? Policies, data policies, like what's an acceptable use case for AI, So like there's so many different steps to it, and I think that's a really good foundational place to start. Is like, okay, I'm going to adopt AI into the organization this year. It's like, what are the first things that I need to do before bringing this in? Because I think people
Exactly.
have there's so many different out of the box, like
Hmm.
AI solutions. So it's like
Yeah.
people go grab them and like implement them without really understanding what adoption will look like, what the true outcomes are that you're looking for, because the outcomes that you might be looking for aren't the outcomes and use cases that your team actually needs to adopt the
Right.
product internally. And
Yep.
then you're also bringing in some security risks if you're not really prepared for that.
Exactly. No, exactly. We kind of see it all over, right? Our VCIO is constantly talking about it, and we're hearing even from our clients a couple of times when they've brought different layers in to help with the AI adoption, and the security policies weren't there in place, and there were a couple of risky situations that are definitely ones that the day-to-day businesses aren't thinking about as they're focused on strategy and they're focused on how to do it quickly and not necessarily in the best approach of doing it effectively and efficiently and securely.
Yep. Because you are putting your data out there, right? So like if
Absolutely.
if you're not, and you got to think about what you do as a company and how people are leveraging it. Like whether you're, hey, I'm putting a contract in here, I'm putting somebody's personal information in here, I'm maybe sharing like very private
Financial data. I
financial
mean,
data,
asking it
right?
to
And
analyze financial data is a big one.
yep, so I think like truly assessing how you're going to leverage it is a critical
Mhm.
first step. Do you have the right policies in place? Do you have the right security infrastructure in place? Like who owns it, right? And how do you mitigate some of that risk while still moving forward with that strategy?
Absolutely. One of the last things I typically have recommended to people recently, right, on the note of the departments, right? You want to have it enable different departments, not necessarily replace, but kind of take a couple steps back and start with what AI can't do, what AI can't replace with the human element, and go from kind of all the points that you spoke on to.
And look, we were talking about this the other day, right? And it kind of starts with like cloud optimization,
Hmm.
and how it can enable faster experimentation to start with.
Yeah.
But I think AI strategy as a whole really requires speed,
Yeah.
and you got to kind of minimize some of those debates. And really focus is like, is your infrastructure prepared for what you're trying to do? And like
Right.
try to avoid some of that over engineering.
Which can happen quickly, right? Of making sure that if you're a Microsoft shop, right, you have certain things in place, and on-prem servers, right? Where is all of that data housed? And sometimes you get in situations where you've migrated partially to the cloud, but you're not all the way there yet, right? It hadn't been budgeted yet for that. And how quickly can we get you there? or, can your partner get you there to make sure that you are optimizing that AI and it's grabbing the right data from the right sources.
Yeah. And like the last point we'll make here before we kind of move to the next piece is like, it's funny when I'll go look at somebody on your team, somebody on my team, and everybody seems to be using AI in one way, shape, or form. But, it's one person might be using one thing, one person might be using another thing. So it's really that important lever that needs to be pulled is that standardization across the organization of what we're going to use, how we're going to use it, and this is the right path forward.
Exactly. Yeah, it's definitely one less vendor to have to manage within an organization, so it helps with that governance piece. Yeah, but I've definitely seen it. The note takers are the famous one, and
Yeah.
everybody has their particular note taker that they like for a certain reason. And yeah, it's kind of, you have to reel that in real quick.
So as we move on a little bit, right, let's kind of focus a little bit more on, some additional steps in security or compliance, right? So we were talking a little bit just now, which I think is a good transition. It's like, whether people are using within the organization unsanctioned tools, right? Like, because the reality is employees are going to adopt these AI tools faster than they do policy. So you have to start with policy before the tool, if that makes sense.
No, it does. That is such a good point. And I don't think people kind of think that through, right? Of putting it in place and honing flush out the ones that are not approved.
Yeah. So it's like, you got to put that policy in place, right? You got to have controls in place. You got to make sure there's audit trails, right? Because what essentially is happening is you're creating risk without awareness, and that is like the absolute worst case scenario.
Correct. Yeah, is definitely with the sprawl of tools, right? It used to be data sprawl, and that the different sprawls of tools. Is there is no governance when you have that. When you have 3 or 4 different note takers, when you have chat GPT, that you have personally is also ingesting all of your work information. There's no way to have any type of governance over that. And that was such a good point you said when, you said they adopt AI sooner than they adopt policy. And it definitely starts with that structure.
Well, all of a sudden you have like data exposure or leakage. Like we talked a little bit about it. You can have like for some organizations it's personal health care information or financial data or regulated data or intellectual property or so like all these AI tools are ingesting that data. So like your data can be retained, reused, exposed, right?
Exactly.
Like without ever knowing. Or so like you don't know, you don't have the visibility, and you definitely didn't give consent.
Right. And so when there is an incident, how do you even know where to go look to even see how far it is? How much exposure and how much risk there is based off of what was leaked, because there is no control over it. You don't know what's out there, and it's really hard to rein that in.
So we're talking a little bit about like policy and all those things, but I still think there is this critical first step before that, right? And it is establishing AI ownership within the organization. So who's going to own it? Now you can have a bunch of different stakeholders when it comes to the strategy piece, or that are going to be stakeholders and like what we're going to do, like, and you're trying to really kind of like do some like product development, right? Like you're going to have additional stakeholders, but you do have to have a single owner, right? Like who's going to own initiating that policy, vetting the tools, who's going to own the outcomes, right? Is it IT? Is it your security team? Is it your legal team? Like what is the business unit that actually owns it?
And I think that's an important piece to discuss, and that will be different for every organization. I can take our top 5 clients and tell you not one of them would have the same owner. Just based off of the various controls that they have in their business and that, they're tied to. And to your point, yeah, everybody thinks of the stakeholders as owners, and that's not it. Because at the end of the day, I call it the Supreme Court. Who at the who at the end of the day is the Supreme Court of whether
Yep.
or not this is the product, this is the one that we're going to move forward with, and to think about that, and it's going to be different for every business.
Yeah. Because at the end of the day, when something goes wrong and there's no clear owner, like that's creating uh the end result is going to be like your reputational risk is there,
Yes.
right? Like it's going to damage you as an organization. So you have to have like clear ownership who's going to define these clear roles within the organization, the outcome, and who's ultimately going to be accountable to it.
No, exactly. And that's what, like, a lot of times it does come down to the security officer
Yeah.
in that role. But a lot of times people don't have a designated one if they're not held to any type of compliance standards. And yeah, like it's without ownership, there's no accountability.
So as we kind of move on a little bit, like one of the things that I really thought would be cool to talk about today, is just like kind of sharing some insights, whether some of the mine, some of the ones that you're seeing, right? Or like what are those top 5 technology priorities for 2026 as it pertains to AI specifically, right? And you heard me allude to it initially, right?
Mhm.
About that moving from experimentation to scale. And, if AI isn't improving day-to-day execution, it's not really strategy.
Correct.
And it's about getting AI operational, right? No longer are we piloting AI within the organization.
Right.
We're trying to make it operational.
Right. And I think that we've definitely had lessons learned in 2024 and 2025 of moving from that piloting to operational, right? And some cleanup that has to be done before that. But to think about the actual workflows that not only can take, the human element almost adds risk, but you add in AI to take those workflows and really mitigate that risk and to think about what they are is something I think it's a great conversation and where all of like I said, I'm going to go back to the data where all of the data lives to help enable those workflows is something that I definitely discuss standardizing platforms. Right. So I go back to the Microsoft Shop example of onboarding, offboarding machines. We have clients that always want to come to us with that example and how can we automate this so that when we scale up really quickly, we can, immediately push out 25, 50 machines in a day or two. That's great. Let's talk about how everything is standardized and it can go from just a click of a button of workflows.
Yep. It's all those like little bitty components that,
Yep.
are going to yield that end result because what you're really trying to do is like measure ROI with
Yep.
productivity. You're trying to improve margin and you're doing that by increasing speed, right? And
Right.
ultimately you're going to provide a better experience, right? And whether
Exactly.
that's us as an organization or, the clients that we serve, right?
Mhm.
Is like sometimes the client experience they're trying to solve is for their employees, right? Like a lot of
Yeah.
people start there, and that's a
Yep.
good place to start, right? But then you start to trickle that into other workflows or business units within the organization where you're like, okay, like how do I streamline some sales enablement, right? Get data readily available for your decision makers, right?
Yes.
In a more clear, concise way that's absent of a little bit of human error,
Yeah.
right? So how do you embed AI to improve service, right? Finance, operation. There's so many different places that, and like these are aspects or core business units that every organization has, so
Absolutely.
everybody's trying to figure out the best way to start with some of those things. And I think sometimes it's really starting internally. You got to always like to use the phrase like you got to eat your own dog food, right?
That's that is a phrase we like to use, right? And look, yeah, definitely it's even internally. So we all see it, the different chat bots, right?
Yeah.
And I think that it's funny to watch that evolution of internal chat box or support chat box moving from agents. And they're really answering questions and they're acting like that digital employee and not just kind of a feature.
Yeah. But I think what people are still missing, right, is that like as you develop, as you implement, you take these strategies to action, you're not like you were kind of mentioning it for a second, like we're going to replace a workforce. You're not like there
Right.
is always going to be a human in the loop, and it's
Yep.
critical, right? It's number one from a data perspective, like you have to have very clean data that's going in. But in order to have adoption, you have to have a human in the loop for oversight,
Yes.
not the execution, just for the oversight part, right?
Right.
There has to be some clear ownership of like the boundaries that you're creating to ensure the outcomes are being met.
Exactly. And you have to have those human in the loops that know what the outcomes look like and what good looks like. I've had a couple conversations with clients when they start talking about it, and the CSMs are reemphasizing the need for possibly a little bit of a reorg, right? Of okay, that human used to have this role in this job, and if we ingest AI to help facilitate it, their role does become different. And what does that new organization look like? Or that department structure look like?
And I always, it's so funny because we have this conversation all the time, but everything starts with clean, well-governed data
Yeah.
across the organization, right? And if you have bad data going in,
Hmm.
the output is going to be awful, right?
Exactly.
So like, what do you think are some of the things that like people need to think about when it comes to whether it's policies or like around data governance to ensure their standardization across the board?
No, I definitely think when it comes to data, right, it can be as simple as naming conventions because AI is going to be triggered, or the workflows that are going to be automated are going to be triggered by something, and it's going to be looking for something similar. So even as something as simple as how you're naming documents so that it can go pull XYZ from, document 123. It's as simple as, where it's saved, of making sure that look across our client accounts and, give me top 5 tickets or top, whether it's, a service industry, top 5 complaints. Where are you pointing it to? Are they all named the same to go point it to there? And so I think just making sure that data is the same place, labeled clearly so you know how to trigger that AI to get the information is something people really aren't thinking about. It's just they're assuming it's smart enough to kind of delve through the mess that
But
that we all create.
or they aren't, right? So and
Yeah.
then what happens is, bad data is creating bad decisions.
Right.
And not only that, then it becomes an adoption issue where now there's distrust in the
Hmm.
data, right? So you've implemented it, you spent money, you brought on all these things and you spent a ton of money, and now your team's not going to use it because they don't trust
Exactly.
it. And
Exactly.
like you still have to go, all right, now let's start from back from the beginning, right? So like who owns the data? How are we going to make sure it's aligned to like the business functions? And I think you made some really key points, right? Is that, where data goes, who's responsible for or allowed to put data in,
Right.
right? What is the standardization? How do we have checks and balances? Like
Who's
how do we
QCing it
course correct?
regularly?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, because I definitely think that the QC is something that we're not always chatting about, because you just assume people know, right? There's a policy. We have an SOP for that. How many times do we hear that? But to actually go in and QC and to make sure that it is put in, consistently the same way to make sure that we're getting those outputs that you spend money on to put in place. And I'm a big believer in, because I've had a couple of clients ask this, well, who really owns making sure that that data is in there? And for me, it's the department that's being enabled by the AI, right? They would own that business outcome of what's going on in that scenario. And so to make sure that that department is also well groomed in their data inputs is going to make sure that they trust it too, because they also know how it works. They know the triggers, they know what to expect, and they're easier. It's a lot easier to spot that when you're in the day to day, so that you can spot if there's an issue with it. Because to your point, sometimes there has to be a human element. You can't just trust what the output is.
It's funny when we talk about like AI readiness, a lot of times we talk about systems, infrastructure, data, but I think there's another component that like people really miss, and there's a people readiness
Yeah.
component to AI adoption, implementation and adoption. And if your people aren't ready, AI adoption is going to fail,
Right.
right? So like I think another great place to like make sure it's is a core component of your internal AI go-to-market strategy, right? Is ensuring that the people are ready for what you're trying to do. And sometimes those aren't necessarily the people that are in those strategy meetings. And part of
Yeah.
that, the stakeholders that are helping drive some of the decision, but they are responsible for the adoption, So like how do you train leaders to think in AI enabled workflows? And this one hits like really home for me because I used to maybe like 2 years ago, right? Or, like when, it was like ChatGPT was just like coming out and this and
Yeah.
that, right? And like people or becoming more prevalent where people would use it. I I used to like discredit when I would receive something from someone that was like pretty obvious that they had used
Yeah. Like, I don't want that ChatGPT
I'm
response.
like, I'm like, you should have taken the time, right? You should have taken
Yeah.
the 30, 45 minutes to put this stuff together. And I'm even watching that evolution for myself, where I want people to use it, right? I
Yeah.
want to eliminate some of those things that used to take 45 minutes to an hour, right? To
Yeah.
do and like, okay, let's condense that down to 10, 15 minutes. And I'm like, now you still have to put that human oversight on
Yeah.
it, right? And like focus on making sure that what we put together is a final product before we share that. But it I encourage it now, right? And I've
Yeah.
even had to have that on my own mindset shift there, right? Whereas like it's acceptable. How do we encourage it? And like, January is a great time where you're talking about comp plans and things like that, right? So
Yeah.
I've been even thinking about like how do we enable supervisors, team members, whatever that looks like, to or redesign their roles and their comp structure and their KPIs where
Yeah.
it's like tied to leveraging AI. It's like interesting to kind of go through that process.
Yeah, it's funny. I've always used the work smarter, not harder thing,
Mhm.
and I do think that saying is where AI comes into place. Of I used to craft these perfect emails to clients, and it's funny the response, especially when you do prompts a certain way. I really encourage my team of just throw that in ChatGPT real quick.
Yeah.
Just XYZ. Like we don't need to spend 30 minutes to write an email. And it'll with the master prompts and everything that we all learn about is something that my team that's an easy quick win. I think from a leadership aspect, you did a great job with the revenue team annual that we just had of bringing somebody in to teach us master prompts and to teach the entire team master prompts and to teach the entire team which different kind of AI tools are best for the different things in their roles, and to kind of encourage it, but to also give them the tools and a little bit of base knowledge to make sure that it's giving them the right outputs the first time, because we all like quick wins. We're a society of ADHD. So
Well,
if you can get a quick win on an output, it helps
it really
that
does,
adoption.
and like the risk isn't technology, right?
Right.
The risk, like the real challenge is change management.
Yes.
Right. And as you're doing these things, you like really want to facilitate that change as a leader or as an organization to point your people in the right direction. Like we could talk about all the governance and the security and all that stuff,
Yeah.
but there are these key components that are the responsibility of the organization as they're doing these things to point people in the right direction, to coach, to train how you're going to do something, right? That way there is consistency across the board, because then your leaders can manage it. Because I think that's the piece that becomes a pretty big challenge is, how do leaders manage how people are doing these things to better manage the outcomes?
Exactly. No, and I remember the initial days before we were really coaching some of the adoption. some of the scopes of work that would come out, and I'm like, well, that was AI, guys. Did we know?
Yeah.
And look, kudos to the early adoption. But definitely it was a showcase of all of the leaders stepping up into making sure that they're giving that tool and that oversight.
So look, I think there's a ton of like road mapping and planning, and I think people are kind of really starting to get the gist of um, almost treating it like development.
Yeah.
Like it really is that. So like I think the next step is how do you take that roadmap? How do you prioritize certain aspects in the organization? And one thing I've been like really encouraging people to do is there's so many big picture ideas out there of what AI can be, but I think it's really critical that people start small,
Yeah.
right? And you have these mini milestones, right?
Hmm.
Because I think it's not you don't need to try to be 2 years ahead of the curve right
Right.
now. It's like let's just start small and
Yeah.
and put things in a way where you can easily quantify them and measure progress. Because I
Yes.
think that's a key component people are missing is like how I have this AI strategy. Here's maybe what I want to do long term, but here's what I'm going to do over the next 2 weeks
Right.
and start to measure adoption, start to measure outcomes, and start to measure success. Because I think people may be problem solving for a much bigger issue,
Yes.
and it's only 10% of the problem. So
Yeah.
you spend 90% of your time trying to solve 10% of the problem.
Exactly. I know it is they immediately kick off to what their biggest pain is instead of getting the quick wins and really getting a framework for it. And it's almost like program management or product management, right? That's a world you know very well. And without knowing where the single throat is,
Yeah.
to make sure that it's choked there,
Yep.
right? That's something we use a lot of a single source to choke in and hold somebody accountable, or hold a department accountable, or hold an outcome accountable. It's really hard to move forward and actually solve something bigger without starting there on something
Yeah.
smaller.
And look, that kind of leads me to the next point is like how we're helping people today,
Yeah.
right? Especially as their managed service provider, like this, we have to do this, right?
Yeah.
So, and this is something we've been really focused on over the last year is understanding what role we should play
Yeah.
with the clients that we serve. And you mentioned it, right? Is like you have to have ownership, right?
Mhm.
And like we even did it internally. Like we have someone who owns our AI outcomes and implementation and what we're going to do, and then we created a strategy team. And like we meet 3 times a month and we talk
Mhm.
about all the different things, whether what clients are telling us, what we're seeing in the space, how we can advance, right? But like we come in and I like to think we're like really good facilitators,
Yeah.
right? And there's a
100%.
bunch of different, pieces that we need to hit here, but like we start talking about ownership, right? Who do you
Mhm.
think like that you're seeing within organizations is typically becomes the owner of the AI strategy?
I really see it fall two places, honestly. It is going to be your security officer, right? At the end of the day, especially within the compliance world, that security officer is going to have oversight over the governance of it. Other than that, I really see it fall on the ops leaders, right? So whether
Yeah.
it's the COO or the VP of ops, they're the ones that are solving the bigger problems. So they really have to understand what the strategy is and where they're going, because that's where your biggest ROI is going to be, is on that ops side.
Yeah. Well, you think about, the some of the biggest risks for an organization or like
Yep.
just the human cost, right? Your soft
Human
costs of
element.
payroll,
Yep.
soft cost of payroll, right? Is your biggest
Yep.
liability as an organization, right? So people start there because the idea is like we can have revenue growth without having the growth of the
Without the
expense of
revenue
people,
growth. Yeah.
right? So like how do
Yep.
we optimize that? So like, one of the things that like we did and I'm also seeing externally is just like creating these strategy groups or like AI steering groups and
Mhm.
having somebody from each facet of the organization, having somebody from ops, having somebody from revenue, having somebody from security, which in most organizations we recommend that being the person who is your owner, right? But your IT person, right? And like we fill that void at times too, and we help to advise on the security side as well, through the form of like really understanding what readiness looks like,
Yep.
and helping define what decisions are right. So what can AI automate versus assist in,
Right.
or like what can't it do? I think
Right.
that's some of the struggles I'm seeing as people try to implement these strategies, is really isolating what they shouldn't do.
Exactly. You can't ever take the human element out of things. It's funny, I was reading an article recently about project management, right? And how a lot of people want to start ingesting AI into that. And there's so much decision making in certain roles like project management or client success, there's certain areas there that decision making on a human level, understanding emotions, understanding risk and business and really weighing a lot all at the same time is something that you really can't replace with AI. AI can enable it. But yeah, to your point, what it can't do and really that human element and where that is a strategy in your business is something that needs to be known.
Yeah. So I keep telling people too, it's like you have to create these internal use cases,
Hmm.
right? And then you have to weight like the features and to help prioritize, right? So
Yeah.
like I'm gonna score this one a one. This one's a two. This one's a three. Like
Yep.
which one adds up to the most, and that's the one we're doing first, right?
Yep.
And like really quantifying that ROI to save time or cut costs immediately.
Hmm.
And I think the next piece is that like you gotta stop trying to boil the ocean. You gotta start where it hurts, right?
Yeah.
Like what is something that when we talk about adoption internally, the problem that I could solve today
Right.
that would impact everyone in that work center, right?
Right.
Where everybody would feel no one super appreciative,
Yeah.
right? But then like really excited about the outcomes and being able to work with AI in a different way.
No, 100%. I think when you have a partner, whether it's an MSP partner or something like that, that is external, some of the best, people to bring in would be an external advisor, partner, what have you, to talk about these use cases because they're going to bring to the table what they've seen in like-minded organizations. Not always same industry, right? I always take it from the front, and my team takes it from the aspect of like-minded organizations. What ultimately are your goals and where they different align, and with these use cases, the quick wins and the big wins are ones that people can speak to and speak to the lessons learned during that use case.
Yeah, and look, I think some of the quick ones that like we adopted internally that I'm usually recommending to others is especially people in the service industry, right? So it's
Yep.
like, hey, like AI facilitated service triage, right?
Yep.
Summarization of issues, recurring issues
Yep.
to better understand root cause detection quickly, right?
Yep.
To touch things once and fix them permanently. And then I'm
Right.
seeing even things in my world, right? Like on the revenue side. So it's like data enrichment, AI driven account research, proposal
Yep.
preparation. And what I'm noticing is as we've implemented some of these things, there has been some resistance, right?
Yep.
But we once we got some people bought in and trained, you're seeing people number obviously use it more, but have
Mhm.
more confidence in the data as like what they're telling their immediate supervisors as outcomes typically ends up being a little more accurate, right? So
Yeah.
whether it's forecasting, whether it's just deal analysis, right? Invoice processing for finance,
Right.
right? Better visibility into the P&L, more real-time visibility into those things. And I think it really boils down to like what are those 3 to 5 use cases with business owners where you can have clear success metrics, because
Hmm.
that's the biggest piece of it. How do you
Right.
save time, and what has the biggest margin impact?
No, 100%. And definitely, when you get that early adoption and you have big impact, a lot of people immediately want to ingest it. And that's when you really start elevating the organization as a whole. Because as you're, replacing some of the mundane processes, people are naturally going to elevate to the next level too.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you made a good point there too. It's like when you're embedding AI into the organization, you really want to start with those like existing workflows
Yep.
today, right? that daily execution, to help reduce some of those manual steps and measure productivity gains. And that's when I was kind of mentioning about like starting small is like when we look at those things, adoption happens when AI feels invisible
Right.
and it's doing its job, and like you're able to measure that success and quantify it in shorter time frames and increments because people get to feel it, they see it,
Exactly.
right? And I think you get to train teams on how AI specifically fits their role.
Yeah, and I mean that's what that's when it does come into play, right? Obviously on the revenue side, we're going to ingest AI a little bit differently than the service side. But to go back and what are you already using and what might you be able to quickly embed in those tools? We're a Salesforce shop, right, on the revenue side. Salesforce definitely has some AI adoption in there, but also how can we facilitate even note takers that automatically pull in the notes so we can constantly go back instead of trying to write up notes after every single meeting or every time we talk to a client or the team is talking to a client or talking to SAs. It's really awesome to see them get those quick wins that way they can delve into the bigger issues and the thinking centers that they have to do throughout the day and not just kind of the mundane processes.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like we were talking about like measuring it or updating like KPIs and like how do you like reward people for using AI, and I think it starts with promoting it internally and sharing that strategy with the organization, like
Hmm.
making it clear to everyone around you what the strategy is, how we're going to measure it, what are those wins that we can promote internally, and then like creating role-based AI training programs on that. Like what you've done is like,
Right.
hey, we've hit that first mini milestone, right? What does that training plan look like for all the people that are going to be adopting or utilizing that specific strategy in a day-to-day capacity? How are you going to measure what they do and their adoption of it? And I think when you're transparent about that and you communicate it effectively, all of a sudden you have this cultural buy-in
Yep.
where people are wanting more versus being resistant.
No, absolutely. You definitely I think that the culture piece is a good thing to hit on and we hadn't mentioned yet is that buy-in. And I think centering around, the culture of we have it around here, win-win-win, right? And when the team adopts that mindset and they're really looking at it as a facilitator to do their job and their job better and for them to only elevate within the organization, everybody rallies around that. I think that's a quick lever on that culture piece that sometimes people miss out on is being able to talk about it openly and they can feel like they are part of it and they're part of that decision making and they're part of the impact that we're making as an organization and not just, somebody that might be, selling a phone system or working a ticket. They get to feel being part of the organization and the strategy behind it is when you're talking about it openly.
No, for sure. And look, that inclusivity really matters when it comes to
Yep.
that. They have to feel like they're part of that roadmap. And I think the organizations that have done that are the ones where I've seen the most success. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, look, I really appreciate you joining me today, and it was like super fun talking about it. I'm actually really excited to maybe do this again, like 90
Yeah.
days from now, and like talk about what that progress has looked like. So. And I thank everybody for joining externally today. And everybody who attended, you're going to get an email afterwards. Number one, thanking you for joining. But number two, you're going to have a link in there to schedule an AI readiness assessment. And I think that's where a great place for people to start, right? Is a
Absolutely.
15-20 minute consultation to just talk about what your strategy is and are you ready, and create that initial first roadmap, if that makes sense. So,
Absolutely.
but cool. Appreciate everybody joining. Hope you have a great day, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, everyone.